Hey, everybody. I have a little bit of bonus content for you today. A few months back, my friend Fred and we attempted to launch a new podcast, and the theme was basically about how one thing from history can unexpectedly lead to another. He's a history major, so the theme was kind of his idea, and since I really don't have an extensive knowledge of history myself, I was just basically his sidekick for this project, and I guess I was kind of the producer too. But Fred is working on getting his PhD, and since that has been pretty overwhelming for him and time consuming, the history podcast has kind of been put on the back burner, at least for now, at least for the time being. But we did record 2 episodes before we pushed pause, and I asked Fred if he'd like me to just go ahead and release them here on this show, and he said yes. They were fun episodes, so I hated to see them go to waste, and maybe there will be a time in the near future where we can revisit the project. But for now, well, we can just listen to them here. A little bit of fair warning on this first one, though, not a huge deal. Since we had delays in launching the project, this first episode may contain a couple of sports references that are a little bit old at this point, a little outdated. We recorded it before the start of the 2022 NFL football season, and that season is now over, but ultimately I don't think that it really affects the quality of the content, so I hope you enjoy it. And here we go.
The Great Big Intergalactic
Seizure.
Fred!
This is not Fred anymore. It's Sean Connery, the Mud Monster now. You have to understand, Seizure. I have a very important topic for this episode. You want to take a guess at what it is?
Is it blimps? Because Sean Connery was in a blimp in Indiana Jones.
Oh, no blimps, my boy.
Is it Jeopardy? Because he was on
No.
that Saturday Night Live skit.
I still like cheesing Trebek, but no, alas, it is not Jeopardy. Today, it's about rugby and its connection to the Denver Broncos. I've heard, Seizure, that you are a big fan of the Broncos.
I am. I'm kind of a lifelong Broncos fan. I think my fandom started back in 1989. What year were you born?
Changing the voice here back to regular voice. I was born in '96, which
96.
is kind of an interesting thing. So your fan has lasted longer than my entire lifespan.
Yeah, I grew up in Central Ohio, and everybody was a Bengals fan or a Cleveland Browns fan, and everybody in my class, they wanted me to choose a side. Who do you like, the Browns or the Bengals? And I'm like, I was a contrarian. I was like, you know what? I'm going to like the Broncos. So that's when my Broncos fandom started. And it was a bittersweet, kind of a rough start because we beat the Cleveland Browns in the AFC Championship that year. But then we kind of got destroyed in the Super Bowl by the San Francisco 49ers that year. It's been a roller coaster ride since then. The Broncos returned to the Super Bowl, I think 8 years later in the 97-98 season in Super Bowl 32. And they won their first Super Bowl against the Green Bay Packers and Brett Favre. And then they returned the following year in Super Bowl 33. And they just kind of destroyed the Atlanta Falcons. And finally, the Broncos had that curse of all those Super Bowl losses from years past off their back.
Well, they had a little bit of that curse in 2013, though, when Seattle decided to wreck their insides.
Yeah, that kind of came back. That kind of brought back some bad feelings. I remember watching that, and that game was pretty much over from play number 1 when the center snapped the ball and it went flying over Peyton Manning's head. And the Broncos never really recovered from that, but that definitely brought back those old feelings from that 49ers year when the 49ers beat the Broncos 55-10. But 2 years later, we came back and we beat the Carolina Panthers and Cam Newton in pretty decent fashion. And
way to go, Caesar. Your team killed Cam Newton's career. How do you feel about that?
He was never the same afterwards, was he?
No, he never was. I mean, To be honest, though, when you're as physical a runner as he was, unfortunately, you do kind of take some bumps and bruises along the way that may have damaged his ability to be the best quarterback in the world. But today is all about this unique connection between the Denver Broncos history and this small little school in this small little town in England called Rugby. And you might be wondering, wait, rugby? What, you mean the sport? Well, yes, the sport, but also there's a school and a town in England called Rugby, which want to take a guess, Caesar, as to why the sport rugby is called rugby?
Well, I'm going to guess that they started playing it there.
Why, technically, yes.
Oh, okay.
It's a little bit complicated, but the rugby school is where the most modern form of rugby began. And so to begin this whole history, we have to actually go back further beyond than when the school's official little rule book came out in 1840s. We have to go all the way back to medieval times where there was a thing called mob football. Now you might be wondering, Caesar, what do you think mob football is?
I would have thought that would have started in Italy.
Maybe, maybe that's right. You got some of the Italian mob families. You have the Calzones and the Lucianos going, I need my bucket. I'm gonna get that bucket of water from the well. Well, you can't get it from me without a game of football. But yes, mob football is kind of a little bit unknown as to where the exact origin started, but it was very popular in England. And the whole concept of mob football was you're trying to get this little ball, or their version of a ball, which often involved a pig's head or even a human head if you're starting to feel violent enough.
Wow.
And you try and take it around, try and take a certain little, I guess you could say, checkpoints or markers that would be points on a little tally sheet, and whoever could get their little ball there to the certain checkpoints in the span of a day would be the winner. The issue is mob football had no team sizes. So in other words, you could have a team of 2 for one side and a team of 50 for the other. It just depended on who felt like joining which team that day. There also were no other rules for how you got the ball over there. In other words, you could not only punch a guy, you could hit them with a weapon, so long as you didn't kill them.
Wow.
In other words, this was a very violent, very bloody affair where there probably were some deaths here and there, some accidental ones. Someone may have hit someone too hard in the head with a mace, but hey, that's what happens when you bring a mace to a sports game. But
I guess the sports have become a lot more civilized over the years.
Yeah, that's true. You think that beer drinking and people getting rowdy over teams losing by a touchdown is some people might go, oh, how awful to hear these rowdy, fans. Go back a couple hundred years, they were bringing knives and swords, just going, hey, just use this.
I think they did that like 5 years ago at San Diego, Oakland games.
That's possible. Some of those fans are a little bit nuts, but also shots fired. Listen, that's Caesar's opinion. I am keeping my sports opinions to myself.
Go Broncos.
That's right. So there's mob football, though. The tradition was there, and it led to this kind of very different offshoots of mob football that would be played by kids. And yes, the kids would also get beat up. At least they didn't have weapons, or as many as some of the adults did. But it became a popular little sport to play around with. Try and get the kids to just get active. They get a little bit physical. They get rough and tumble. It was a good time for everybody, supposedly. And a lot of schools were trying to utilize this mob football as a little physical activity, like recess. And one of the schools that implemented this mob football and used it was the Rugby School. Now, Rugby School is in Rugby, England, in Warwickshire. And do not ask me exactly where the exact location in England is. You can look it up yourself to find where the exact location of Rugby is. The importance of it, though, is what the school does for the history of football. The Rugby School was founded in 1567 by a very interesting name that might be a little bit hard to believe is a real name, but Lawrence Sheriff. Yes, his last name was Sheriff. Now, not as much known about Mr. Sheriff, other than he probably was a member of the clergy, as many schools founded in the 16th century were kind of based upon religious education, or were people from the clergy, people from the Church of England. They would be the ones to create these schools in order to educate children. And this was originally created to be a free grammar school. So this was an opportunity for kids that maybe didn't have as much money in the family. They go to the school, learn the grammar, learn the English language, which at the time was Middle English, as it is called, or some people may know it as Elizabethan English. So think about, Shakespeare, Thy Rose and Romeo and Juliet. That type of language was taught at this grammar school. Maybe a little bit less ornery, maybe not necessarily to the degree of Shakespeare, but all the same, though, they were taught strong English in order to be exemplary gentlemen of society. Originally, this school was meant for all boys and would be that way for a couple hundred years until it would become co-ed several centuries down the line. What's interesting about the Rugby school is that it becomes one of the founding schools for public education in the country of England. It's interesting that at the time when the public school system starts up in the 1860s for England, the English government went, "Boy, there are not enough education houses for these young lads. They don't know how to read." And they look at the Rugby school, this pristine institution with this big old spires and its old looking windows, and go, "Boy, why don't we make this school more accessible to the public?" Because at the time, even though technically the school was found to be a free grammar school, there was always some fees involved with trying to get in, because you couldn't simply just get in and be someone who was dirt poor. You need to have a little bit of persuasion to make sure that you got your child in that school. Mm-hmm. Throwing a couple dollars to the priest here and there. The priest just takes it and goes, "Thank you for your wonderful contribution to God." And that right there is going to be Fred's most controversial statement of the night. But if you know your history, unfortunately, Christian parishioners taking money on the side for personal profit is not something that is uncommon, particularly around the time of the medieval to the early modern period of European history.
I think that still happens, doesn't it?
Oh, it still does. It's just that it's a little bit, you get caught. Before, you just blatantly would just do it. They just pay you. In fact, this is a little bit of a side note, but do you know about indulgences and how you would pay them?
No, I've never heard of that.
So way back in the later, I'd say like the late medieval period. So we're talking about 14th, 15th, 16th century. Catholic followers would go up to a priest, a deacon, so on and so forth. I'm afraid I don't know the exact terminology, so if I jumble those terminologies for our listeners, please forgive me. I was raised to be kind of just a regular Christian, but nothing like a specific Catholic or any specific denomination. And these Catholic followers would go up to whatever the local leader was and goes, "Well, I committed this sin where I might have murdered my sister." And the church person would go, "That's horrible, but do not worry. So long as you donate, let's say like 50 shillings to the church, we will make sure that we send in a word to God, so that way God will forgive you for your sin." Therefore, this is all about people would commit the crime and then they pay it off to the church in order to then be officially forgiven by God. And this is kind of one of these things where it was basically just legalized bribing. And as such was the issue with this type of, I guess you could say, forgiveness, that Martin Luther, the founder of Lutheranism, and kind of the major reason that even the Protestants, Lutheranism, and all this other little, think about evangelicals, they all stem back to this Martin Luther guy who said, "That's terribly messed up. The church is just profiting off of these payments. Like, we're not even sure if God would accept this." And all the Catholic officials went, "We have no idea what you're talking about. Start the pool. Start the golden pool." And Martin Luther simply said that enough's enough. And he posted this 99 paragraph statement that basically had all his protests against the Catholic Church. Such was the outrage about this particular statement that it became that Martin Luther was effectively banned from the Catholic Church. And Martin Luther created his own unique denomination called Lutheranism, which is the father of pretty much any form of Protestantism you could think of. Any form of Protestants, they could trace their origins to Martin Luther and him deciding to nail a huge amount of paper with a bunch of words on it to a church door.
So what you're saying is that Protestantism, is that the right word?
Yeah.
Is all a result of trying to get away from godly bribery?
Well, it's interesting you say that. It's mostly true, but there's tons of other little reasons that Lutheranism eventually splits off from the Catholic Church. Basically, it was a whole bunch of protests about not just indulgences, but various other different, maybe let's just say, malpractices of the church, including the Pope having orgies, which Martin Luther did not like.
Hmm.
As you go, how is the mouth of God doing something so unholy like having orgies with prostitutes? Kind of a little bit of a controversy.
What year did you say this was?
Oh, this is like the 15th century, give
Okay.
or take. This is when it all kind of pops off.
Yeah.
But with all these indulgences is that, like anything else, though, there is a little bit of corruption, and this included the rugby school. Now we're fast forwarding all the way back to around the time of the 1860s, where the English government goes, hey, we need to create a proper education system for those who are of unfortunate circumstances. So it's kids working in mines, people from poor families, and they create the public education system. And rugby school becomes one of the 9 founding schools for the nation's public education system, which is a huge, I guess you could say, status for the rugby school. And then from then on, from the mid 19th century onward, the rugby school becomes a very prestigious school to go to because it's one of the founding institutions for public education. And here's some of the notable alumni that come from that school. So Neville Chamberlain, the prime minister or the former prime minister of Great Britain. I don't know if you know, Caesar, about Neville Chamberlain. He actually was a prime minister around the time of Hitler.
Wow. No, I don't know about that.
So Chamberlain was prime minister when Hitler actually just became chancellor and became dictator. This is right before Churchill took over and then becomes the famous prime minister of that period.
Okay.
But he was the one who, Neville Chamberlain actually went to Hitler after Hitler started to do some aggressive land grabbing that was legal but not legal. And Neville went, "Oi, mate, can you please not take more land illegally, please?" And Hitler said, "Okay, I will try that." And Neville, and the famous image, Chamberlain comes back in a plane and goes, "I have peace for our time. Germany won't do anything." Literally, a couple months to a year later, Germany's invaded Poland. And basically, Chamberlain was out of the spotlight, forever shaved. And that, of course, led to that famous rise of Churchill.
Are you saying that Churchill's president or what is that? Prime minister?
Prime ministership, yeah.
Prime ministership is that was a result of the other guy getting kicked out because Hitler invaded Poland?
His popularity was a result of Chamberlain. Yeah, actually, it was because Chamberlain wanted to resign. He resigned, and Churchill kind of stepped into power. So it's very interesting that Chamberlain, he has the little notes that says we have peace for our time, and then it all fails, and then Churchill rises to power because Chamberlain's so ashamed he steps away from politics. And then the next famous alumni on this list here is Lewis Carroll. Caesar, do you know Lewis Carroll and what he wrote?
A Christmas Carol?
Yeah, that's a good one, but not quite, although it's a great guess. He wrote Alice in Wonderland. So he's the author of Alice in Wonderland and the various different little books and novels that come in that whole series. So he's one of the famous alumni. But most importantly, William Webb Ellis is an important alumni, and he's really important because he is considered the legendary founder of modern-day rugby. Now, Mr. Ellis was a young lad who was playing mob football, and they're trying to score, trying to get their little points, get past the checkpoint where they need to put the ball in. And Mr. Ellis decided to carry this ball, supposedly, like the form of rugby today. So think about it like a running back, running with the ball in the hand tucked under and just trying to run like a running back. So you can imagine this maybe slightly ill, skinny British boy just knocking over this little other British little boys trying to drag the ball all the way to the checkpoint in order to get his team the win. So this was supposedly the origin of modern rugby, as no one had ever ran the ball that way before. But unfortunately, it might just be a little bit of a myth, as rugby historians have claimed that this is probably just a bunch of bogus. And what probably happened is that the mob football just got a little too violent at the rugby school, And therefore, the rugby school decided to offer up an official list of rules for the game of mob football, which eventually would evolve into the name of rugby. With these official rules passed down in 1845, a lot of other schools started to hear about this form of rules because they had problems with violence in their mob football games. So they started to implement those rules. And one particular set of schools that started to implement these rules from this rugby school were some schools in the United States, in part due to their connection to England. And the fact is that the universities in America were connected to the education system in Great Britain. Therefore, word got around about these new set of rules for this very violent game that was frequently played on university campuses. American students loved the idea of having more official games, and they started to implement these more rigid versions of mob football, which again becomes rugby. And over time, because of these new rules, people started to play around with them. And because they started to play around with them, some crazy guys had an idea. Let's take a little bit of the rugby rules plus a little bit of European football rules, so that's like soccer, and let's combine them together into this new form of game. And this new form of game would become something that we know and love, American football.
Yes, but I do have a question.
Sure.
Before they came up with those rules of how to carry it in modern times, as we think of as rugby today, what were they doing before?
They could carry in any shape and form. So some would carry it over their head, some would carry it like two arms, like trying to carry a basket. It's basically a whole bunch of rules. Some people just kicked it around to try and get to the checkpoint. But what often happened would be, someone would take out someone's legs or try and break them, or someone would try and rip someone's arm, not effectively off, but try and break it in order to get the hand on the ball. But because of the modern rugby position, or basically the way that running backs carry the ball, just think of more, maybe a little bit less athletic version of that. It was actually harder to get the ball out because then, now the person could actually focus on running and jump over people, but also, they didn't have to worry about necessarily their arm getting completely dislodged since they're tightly holding onto it in that running back-like position.
So it's just like less rules and less technique and just do whatever you want to do kind of thing.
It's pure mob violence. That's why it's called mob football.
Okay.
Yeah, heck, sometimes there wasn't even any form of carrying. Sometimes you just see someone try and push the ball away and you just kick them in the face, and then you just try and go there and try and just grab onto it or kick the ball and push it forward. Then you get kicked in the face. It was all chaotic, all very bloody mess. So then we get to the first ever American football game, which is supposedly Rutgers versus Princeton in 1869. And this begins the official game of football. We then fast forward a couple years and we get to a man named Walter Camp, a Yale student, who said, hey, this game is still too violent. We need to figure out ways to make this a little bit better. So Walter Camp introduces a series of different laws that eventually get passed by let's just say the football board for this collegiate group of people. So think about the Ivy Leagues. They had a little collegiate group that would help determine the rules of this newfound game. So Walter Camp proposes 11-men teams, a line of scrimmage, a center to QB snap for every play, and a 3-down system, which would become the famous 4-down system that we know today. So Walter Camp introduced a whole bunch of new regulatory rules that begin this revolution where the game looks a lot more organized, it's less chaotic, it's now got game plans, there's now really positions like a running back, a quarterback, a center, there's offensive linemen. It becomes quite organized quite quickly. And then we get to this point where the game now begins to reach more of the professional sphere. Now you can have college teams that are popping up everywhere because it's easy to implement. And therefore you have a bunch of people who graduate college and go, hey, I want to play this game again. But now with no college kids. And that's where the professional football leagues start to come in.
I didn't realize that Rutgers had so much notoriety. I just thought when they joined the Big Ten that it's like, oh, yeah. But
that's right.
But they have great history. I didn't realize that.
Oh, yes. Rutgers has a fantastic history with the game of football. Just don't ask them about how many titles they've won.
Oh, no. Is it a goose egg?
Oh, no, it's not a goose egg. It's just that some of the titles are maybe 100 years old. And you go, Okay, no one was alive to see that title.
Well, that's how a lot of Michigan's championships were way back then too. So
That's
they
right.
they still brag about those. So
That's right. That's right. And basically, the point is, if your championship is north of 30 years, 30 to 50 years, it's time to just kind of ignore and just go, it's in the past.
and the Yankees
Yes, and the Yankees, of course, with their 27 rings.
and the Canadians who haven't won a championship since in the 90s.
That okay. Well, people still remember that one, so we might have to hold off on that one, Caesar. Let's not get in too much boiling water in this second episode.
Yes.
And so it's interesting that at one point in time, Caesar, field goals were worth more than touchdowns until the early 20th century. At one point in time, touchdowns only counted for 2 points, and field goals counted for 5.
Well, kicking is harder than running into an end zone. Have you ever tried kicking a football into a goalpost?
I've tried it, and each time it seems like my toes is screaming pain.
I've tried to kick it like from just like 15 yards away, and it's hard. It's really hard. But it's not as exciting as, watching someone score a touchdown.
That's true. I mean, the Fred the Mud Monster can easily just maul over people and they'd be consumed by the mud and I can get into the end zone. But imagine a mud foot trying to kick a football. It just be sad.
You've got pretty big feet.
That's true. I do. However, with big feet comes sometimes the unfortunate reality of the ball does not get kicked right and ball does not travel far. We then get to the starting of the professional leagues, and the NFL is founded in a car dealership in Canton, Ohio in 1920. That's right. You heard it right. You heard it here first. They were founded in a car dealership. How American is that? Now we're going to fast forward a little bit here. There are some key moments in football that I've not discussed, like the creation of the forward pass, the creation of the creation of the creation of the moving the chains, and other famous football terminologies. But what's most important, though, is that we get to those lovely Denver Broncos. So we're fast forwarding again a couple decades to 1959. Now, Caesar, why do you think this might be a good year?
Is this the first year that the Broncos came into the league?
Indeed, that is correct. Ding, ding,
yes.
ding, ding, ding. So 1959, Bob Howsam, and yes, that's a real name, Howsam, minority MLB owner, founded the Broncos. And why do you think he founded the Broncos? It's actually interesting why he decided to create the Denver Broncos.
I'm not sure. This would have been the AFL, not the NFL, right?
Yes, this would be the American Football League.
I'm not sure the exact reason. Was it to kind of counter the NFL?
Well, that's part of the reason for the AFL's creation, because a bunch of owners wanted to create their own football teams. The NFL's like, no, go away. And so they said, enough of this then. We're going to create our own fun league. So they created the American Football League. And Bob Howsam, while he also is not maybe the biggest fan of the NFL, the main reason he created the Broncos was because he created a stadium called Bears Stadium. And Bears Stadium was meant to be the stadium that's going to house an MLB team. Unfortunately, the Major League Baseball simply said, we're not going to put a team in Denver. Not yet. And not now. Bob Howsam's distraught. He has to figure out what he's going to do with this ginormous stadium. Well, he thought, let's put a football team in it. He goes to the AFL and goes, can I create a team? And they went, why not? Suddenly, you create the wonderful Denver Broncos. And you might be wondering, Caesar, what is Bear Stadium and where is it now?
Is that the former Mile High Stadium?
It is current Mile High Stadium. Bear Stadium is basically Mile High Stadium. You just have to imagine Mile High Stadium is just a much bigger version of Bear Stadium, but that same ground is where that stadium was originally created in the 1950s. And it was a place where you'd see minor league baseball. And suddenly it becomes more famous for being the home of the Denver Broncos. All because Bob Howsam basically went and said, I need to fill seats into the stadium because a minor league team is not going to bring enough seats or not bring enough butts to the seats for the stadium. And thusly, the Denver Broncos are born because American football is a way to bring a whole bunch of people into a stadium.
Okay, so the modern version of that name is called and I didn't even know this until I looked it up, is called Empower Field at Mile High.
Empower Field at Mile High. That's right. The more modern name, but the point is that the Bear Stadium is the oldest version of Mile High Stadium, and that's where the Broncos played and still play technically. And thusly, we then get to the AFL. The AFL and the NFL begin to butt heads. We then go into probably some history that a lot of our listeners know. You have the AFL NFL tension, the creation of the Super Bowl, because obviously AFL wanted to see which team was superior. Then we get Joe Namath who goes, I guarantee we'll win. And thusly, when the NFL lost, they went, oh, maybe we should just merge these leagues together into one league, let's say, under our name, of course. And the NFL just went, the heck with it. We got the more Super Bowls so far. We'll agree to these terms. And thusly, we get the Broncos in the NFL. And from this point forward, this is now all about Caesar, maybe just giving us some brief little highlights from the Broncos years.
Oh, well, looks like we have Russell Wilson. Remember how you were saying that we got beat up pretty bad in Super Bowl 48 by the Seattle Seahawks? He is our newest quarterback. It's always strange when the guy who used to beat you, becomes your quarterback or becomes part of your team. That's something that I've had a lot of. I'm an Ohio State fan as well. And Urban Meyer, the guy who beat us in the national championship when he was with the Florida Gators, all of a sudden, this guy I couldn't stand became our head coach for the Ohio State Buckeyes. And, that's not the first time that's happened. Bill Romanowski, the San Francisco 49er, who played against the Broncos in the Super Bowl, that when we lost that horrible Super Bowl, he became part of the team that won those last two Super Bowls in 97 and 98. So I guess Russell Wilson's just kind of like that as well. He's going to be that guy that beat us once, and now he's our hope. Ohio State won a national championship with Urban Meyer, after he beat us in a previous national championship. And I was looking back at that Super Bowl, that team in the late 90s. It was Mike Shanahan and John Elway and Terrell Davis and Bill Romanowski and Shannon Sharp, Mark Schlereth, Rod Smith, Ed McCaffrey. That was kind of one of those, how Tom Brady brings all these old veterans with him wherever he goes. That's kind of how John Elway was in his later years. Everybody knew that they could come to Denver and win that championship, win that Super Bowl there. So all those old timers at the end of their career, they just kind of flocked to Denver. And by the time they played Atlanta in 99, they were unstoppable. I think the only reason that they ever lost a game that season, that was the only season I've ever had NFL Sunday tickets. So I watched almost every Broncos game. None of those games were all that good because that team was just so talented.
Too good.
Yeah. And I think the only reason they lost those last two games is because they sat their starters. And then they won every game in the playoffs and went on to win the Super Bowl.
I'm not the biggest fan of teams sitting their players. Like, if you're on the verge of 16-0, why don't you want to claim that right? Like the Colts did that in 2009. And then look what happened. The Colts were like, oh, we're going to win the Super Bowl. We're going to rest our guys. And then they lost. I still believe that if they went and said, to heck with it, we're going to go for 16-0. They go 16-0. Then they could go all the way to beat the Saints, and they become a team of history. Instead, they go, oh, but our starters are tired. I'm like, it's about morale here. You could worry about getting rest when you're going to bed at night.
What's the name of the new Broncos owner? Is it Sam Walton?
Sam Walton? Hold on, we have to confirm. I'm afraid my research only goes to any times in history before the mid 20th century. Once we get past the mid 20th century, I'm afraid I'm about as reliable as Donald Trump in terms of facts.
Rob Walton is his name.
Rob Walton.
So I think the future looks good for Denver. They have, this guy is one of the owners of Walmart, probably one of the founders' kids, if I had to guess.
Maybe even grandkids. Walmart's been around for forever.
Yeah. And well, he's pretty old too, but suddenly Denver's looking up, the Broncos' future is in good hands because all of a sudden they have all that Walmart money and they're talking about getting a new jersey and a new stadium, like maybe put a dome on the old one or even start a new one, start construction of a new stadium. And I'm not a huge fan of Walmart, but I like their money going into my team.
That's right. And just think, Caesar, all this connection with Walmart, the Broncos, it all goes back to a bunch of English kids going, "Boy, you from that rugby school, right? Tell me how you carry that. Tell me how you carry that football again." And that's, ladies and gentlemen, is the history, the connection between rugby school and the rise of the Denver Broncos.
Brilliant.
Thank you to all of our listeners, and we hope to see you for our episode 3.
Later. Thanks for listening to the show. The Great Big Intergalactic can be heard on Spreaker, Spotify, YouTube, Google Play, Apple iTunes, and anywhere else that podcasts can be heard. If social media is your thing, you can follow the program on Facebook or Twitter. If you enjoy the show, upvote, share, like, and subscribe. Whenever and wherever those things can be done. If you'd like to send feedback, the easiest way to do that is to email the show at tgbiuniverse@gmail.com. TGBI as in the Great Big Intergalactic. Or you can leave a voicemail at 216-200-7940. Contributions could include written feedback, audio submissions, voicemails, or potentially even live guests. It was great having you today, and see you next time.